Kaylee Cuoco and Sam Claflin star in the MGM Plus original series, Vanished. When the man Alice loves disappears on a train to the south of France, every romantic memory becomes evidence. Every intimate detail, a potential threat. She thought she knew everything about him, but she may not even know his real name. 4-part thriller Vanished premieres February 1st on MGM Plus. Finding the truth is a dangerous affair.
This is the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm so pleased to welcome back to the show, Annie Whitehead. Welcome.
Oh, thank you for inviting me back. It's lovely to chat to you again.
I said before we started recording, I'd love to have you on to talk about Anglo-Saxons because I'm fascinated by that time period. And for me, you are the go-to person for this. So thank you again.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say so.
I feel like every time you're on, I want to talk about Alfred the Great because he is the one that everybody thinks of, I think, immediately when you think Anglo-Saxon. But I don't know that I necessarily want to put the spotlight on him today. I kind of want to look a little bit more at women of the time. Why don't we start with maybe if you had to introduce listeners to Anglo-Saxon women in one sentence, what would you say about them?
Oh, I would say that if you don't know about the period, you would be really surprised about how much power and influence and agency they actually had. When we're talking about the upper classes, certainly, I think it would surprise most people who don't know too much about this era, how much they had a say in their own lives.
Yeah, that really is surprising because I think we look back at that time period and we imagine what we see in film and in TV where they're either an afterthought where they're just kind of filling scenes to balance it out a little bit more, or they are the starring figure like Ethelflaed, right? It's one or the other.
Yeah. And I think to a certain extent, when you're talking about, dramatization, that's pretty much true, unfortunately, of most historical periods. Mm-hmm. I think, women do need to be brought to the fore a little bit more because they were there. They weren't doing what men were doing. They weren't fighting, certainly not in this period. They weren't fighting. We've got no evidence that in England, it wasn't England at the time, but let's, for ease, call it that. There's no evidence that women were actually fighting. We don't have the same kind of female warrior burials that you get, say, in Scandinavia. Mm-hmm. So they weren't doing men's jobs necessarily, apart from Athelflaed, of course, who was actually ruling a country, but she was almost unique in doing that. But they had so much power and influence in other ways, and their stories are really interesting and dramatic, and I think they do deserve to be told, and they do get overlooked, like you say, unless they are, one of the leading characters. Athelflaed, I mean, talking about the Tudors, and obviously we've got Elizabeth I, we've got Anne Boleyn, who, continues to interest and fascinate people, but on the whole, it's the men who get all the headlines, don't they? I think that's the thing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why on this show I'd like to really focus on the women, because I feel like for so long the focus was the men in the contemporary evidence. And I'm always curious about this. When you research this time period, how difficult is it to find threads of women in these documents?
It's actually not quite as hard as you might think. I mean, despite the fact, obviously, one thing that I need to say straight away is that all of the history at this moment was written by men. Well, I say all. I'll come back to that. The main chroniclers that we have were men. They were monks. Apart from one notable exception, all the chronicles and histories that we have that are contemporary or even slightly later were written by religious men. We do have one chronicle which was written by a 10th century nobleman. He was actually a member of the royal family, but he's an exception to the rule. But we do have evidence, archaeological evidence, that an abbey at Whitby which was famously founded by St Hild or St Hilda, there were actually female scribes in that abbey. There's evidence that suggests that styli, the stylus that they would use to write on wax tablets. There's evidence of bookbinding, so they are translating works. So when I say that it's all written by the men, that's not true. There were women scribes, but we don't have any histories that were written by women that we know of. It's the ones that have survived by the men. But amongst, within those pages, we can find lots of detail about the women's history. So we're quite lucky in that regard. It's not quite so dark as the old name Dark Ages would suggest. We do have quite a lot of evidence, and not just in histories. We've got wills written by noble women, so we know how they lived and what they had in their households and what they were bequeathing to their friends and family. And that in itself is a really interesting point, because, of course, Anglo-Saxon women, noble women, were allowed to bequeath their property and their wealth to whomsoever they wanted to. It belonged to them. Whatever they took into a marriage, they took out again if the marriage ended in separation or divorce. So they had a lot more rights than you would first imagine. And we do have evidence about them, but you have to kind of read between the lines a lot of times, and we do need the backup, as it were, of archaeological evidence, because, as I said, most of these histories were written by men, and they weren't that interested in the women. And that famous chronicle that I mentioned, that the guy was not a monk, he was a member of the royal family, and he still only referred to Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, as the King of Wessex's sister. He didn't name her. So even he wasn't that interested in women's history. But we can pick little bits up from various places, and we can put together quite a decent picture.
I feel like there's so much about this time period that I don't understand, and forgive me if I sound ignorant to both you and the listeners. But when a woman was born during this time, whether she was just a normal girl, just a normal subject, or what we would call a noble woman, what would their life have looked like, or how would it have been different between those two type of people?
Well, obviously, we don't know as much about the ordinary people, because the people who were writing the chronicles, they weren't interested.
Yeah, right.
Essentially, what we can find out about the ordinary folk is, again, mainly through archaeological evidence and also through the laws, because there were a lot of written law codes that have survived. They go back as early as the 7th century, and in amongst those law codes, you can see things like, we know there, for example, there were different classes of slaves, because the Anglo-Saxons did have slaves. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. And you can find out various things from the law codes. There's certain things like, I can't remember whose law it is, but there is one, and I love it. The idea that if a man brings stolen property into the house, the wife is not allowed to do anything about that. I think I've got that right. But we know that women had their own keys to their own households, that they were, essentially running their own homes. Obviously, they would have been working in the fields, I imagine, embroidery, needlework, dyeing, fabric dyeing, and all that sort of the processing of textiles. That seems to have been largely women's work. And we do know that labour was kind of divided like that into men's work and women's work. But on the other hand, we do have certain words where they're sort of gendered for the same occupation, and some that aren't. For example, I can't, and again, listeners might correct me, I can't off the top of my head think of the male equivalent of seamstress, for example. But a lot of these sort of job names that we now know do come to us from Old English, from the Anglo-Saxon era. So you have a baker, but you also have a baxter. And the baker would be the man and the baxter is the woman. So that's one example where you can see that it's the same job, but there's different words depending on the gender. So that's just one little example. And as I say, the laws are quite comprehensive, and they do oftentimes refer specifically to women. Not necessarily in fantastic terms. There's quite a bit. I think it's Alfred's laws that talk about what happens if one man, I'm sorry to say this, rapes the slave of another, and the compensation that is owed in that case does depend on, again, the class of the slave. So we're not getting the impression that these women's feelings or physical hurts are taken too much into consideration. But another thing we have to remember is that the word mankind, in Old English, man meant humans. So a lot of times these laws, they're not gender specific because there's no need for them to be. Because where it says man, it literally just means person. So that's something else to bear in mind. But obviously we do know a lot more about the nobility, particularly the royals. We know, for example, that Alfred the Great made sure that all his children were educated, and we do have a lot of detail about that. And his son, Edward the Elder, we know that his daughters were educated, but in a manner that fitted them to the role of a royal wife. So, they were taught needlework, embroidery, that kind of thing. There's nowhere that mentions that they were taught to fight, which is another reason that I don't believe that there were warrior women in this period. But there's a distinct difference already. The noble and the royal women were educated, and actually we know that Alfred's children were educated alongside other noble non-royal children. So you get this idea that there was a little local school where the princes and the princesses, not that they use those terms, were being schooled alongside their social contemporaries. So that's a nice little detail that we've got as well.
So I'm curious too, when we talk about them being taught by somebody or tutored by somebody, are we looking at maybe similar to the medieval time when they were taught by priests or by some kind of religious person? Is that who was educating them?
We have to assume so. It's not actually said, it's not specified. So the reason we know so much about Alfred the Great's life and that of his children when they were young is because he commissioned a monk named Asa, who's a Welshman, to come to his court and essentially write his life story. So it's an authorized biography, but actually written while Alfred was still alive. So Asa knew the family really well. And he says, and I think this is the exact quote, the younger children were at all times fostered at the royal court. And he talks about them going to school. But again, I'm pretty sure I'm correct in saying he doesn't specify who is educating these children, but it does seem to be the idea that this is not a private lesson. This is not, as you'd imagine, a governess or a tutor coming just to teach the royal children, because it's the local noble children as well. But there isn't a detail beyond that, but we have to assume, because at this point, really, the only learned people were religious people. They were the ones who were educated enough to pass that knowledge on. And interestingly, because I often write about the Kingdom of Mercia. That's my sort of, specialized area of interest. And Alfred did import a lot of Mercian clerical people, scholars, because he couldn't find the equivalent in the Kingdom of Wessex. So I always smile a little bit to think, oh yeah, it was actually Mercia who was educating these people.
I love how you mentioned that he had an authorized biography, because it just goes to show that people don't change over time, do they really? Alfred's sitting there, he's the king, and he's like, you know what? I think I want somebody to document my life so that future generations know about it.
Yeah, it's not the only one we have, but it's the nature of it is much more, very much a literal biography. This happened and then that happened. Other works were commissioned later on by other royals, and actually, interestingly, 2 of them by women. So Edward the Confessor's wife Edith Godwinson had a work commissioned, which is it's a book of two halves. It seems like initially it was commissioned to write the history of her illustrious family, because actually they weren't that illustrious. Her grandfather was a commoner. But it kind of changes nature halfway through, and we think it's because at the time she became queen, everything looked golden and rosy, and then, as we know, 1066 happened, and it very quickly becomes the story of Edward's death and what happened there. But she commissioned that. And the other more famous example, and the more interesting one for me, is by Queen Emma, who was married first to Athelred the Unready and then to Canute. And after Canute died, she got into dispute with Canute's first. A lot of people call her a concubine. I would say that he considered her to be his first wife, and he never put her aside when he married Emma. So, but what he did essentially was he died quite young, left two widows, both of whom had grown sons who were then sort of fighting for control of the kingdom. And Emma commissioned, it wasn't a story about her so much as justifying her claims for her son and trashing the other side. And I often call it, the first piece of spin. And it really is such a piece of propaganda. It's really sort of laying into the other side and saying, oh, do you know what? He wasn't even, he's not even a royal, but it was a baby was smuggled out. And, this kind of, the Archbishop refused to, condone him and he couldn't claim his rights because nobody believed that he was even a royal person, really throwing the mud around. But again, it was a woman, an ex-queen, dowager queen, who'd had this work commissioned. So Alfred was maybe the first, but he wasn't the only one. But his is a little bit less dramatic because it is literally just laying out the facts, give or take. Obviously, it shows him in a fantastic light.
Right.
And obviously, it would, right?
Yeah.
But, it is so useful to have that, because whatever else we can say about it, and maybe it's not all true, what we know for certain is absolutely contemporary, and that is just, it's gold, to have that and to know that this was written while its subject was still alive. That's so precious, because we don't have very much of that for this period, unfortunately. So yeah, it's a gold mine.
I love that you brought up Emma of Normandy, because I'm just fascinated by her.
She's such a character.
Isn't she? Like, I don't know. When I think of her, I immediately think like the strong woman who was fiercely intelligent and she knew what she was doing. I don't study this time period, but that's my impression of her, and I just want to learn so much more about her.
She's incredible. I can't say that I find her hugely likable, but I think she had a tough time during her first marriage. I don't think Athelred the Unready would have been an easy person to live with. I mean, some of his behaviour kind of borders on the paranoid. But what she did, as I say, when she commissioned this piece, the Encomium Memor Reginae, she ignored completely. There is no mention in the whole of this work of her first husband or her two sons by him. It's almost like she just threw all her weight behind her, son by Canute, and tried to get him on the throne, which eventually did happen. I mean, both those two sons of Canute who were fighting it out did both rule, but for a very short period. And then, of course, at that point, after those two had died, it's then that Emma suddenly seems to remember, oh yeah, I had another couple of sons. They're over in Normandy. I'll call them back. But there's this whole thing in the Encomium about a supposedly forged letter, because when her sons Edward and his brother Alfred came over, there was a terrible tragedy because Edward found, the English people weren't really willing and waiting for him to come back. He sailed back to Normandy. Alfred was captured and subsequently killed. And there was a lot of finger pointing and blaming, or, Alfred was killed by this person or that person. And this letter that was supposedly written by Emma asking her sons to come over was then later claimed to be a forgery. And, there's this whole sort of argument as if she called her sons over, if that letter was genuine, excuse me, then she was responsible ultimately in a way for the death of one of them.
Yeah.
But if she didn't write the letter, who did? So this period is great for all these murky politics and skullduggery, and Emma is at the heart of this and really fighting not only for her own survival but for her sons, but she's picking and choosing which sons to fight for.
Yeah.
So it makes her a very complex character, I think. I mean, she hadn't seen her elder sons for a long time because they'd gone over to Normandy when Canute came and took over. We don't know whether she married Canute through political expediency or whether she was forced to. Because, again, although, as I said at the start of this, we do know a lot about these women and what happened to them. Of course, what we don't know is their motivation. We are told that Canute and Emma got married, but we can only make assumptions about how that decision came to be made. My thinking is it's more likely that Canute, although Emma was, as you say, Emma of Normandy, she was Norman, but of course at this point she was very much still the English queen, and Canute may have felt that that's what he needed to help establish his own kingship. So it's possible that she was more of a prize to him than he was to her. But then again, she might just have thought, well, do you know what? My first husband was a dud. This guy seems to have a bit more about him. We don't know, because we're never told what these women thought. That's the difficulty, but it's great. And there are a couple of novels that have been written about Emma, just playing with these ideas. And it's a historical fiction writer's dream, really, a character like that, because there's enough that we do know about her and enough that we don't, that you can make a brilliant novel out of her life.
Oh, that's what I love about historical fiction, because then you can just fill in the gaps, right? You decide.
That's where the fun is, and I think that's the difference. When you're writing non-fiction, you can just say, we don't know. We can guess. This might be a reasonable answer because of X, Y, Z. But the novelists can just go to town because they have to. They can't have characters behaving in a certain way and not explain why they did that. Yeah. So I think, in fiction, in some ways you get more to the heart of the real people. If that's kind of nonsensical, but it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. I'm a little bit curious on your thoughts, because I know we don't know how these people felt. They didn't leave us a diary and said, today I felt sad because so-and-so did this. We don't have any of that. But why do you think that she put more stock into her sons with Canute than her other sons?
Well, it's interesting because, Edward and Alfred were in Normandy, so they weren't in a position to take the throne when Canute died, but then neither was her son by Canute. So half of Canute was stuck in Denmark, and this was part of the problem, that Canute's first wife, I'm going to call her that, Alfeva of Northampton, and her son Harold Harefoot were able to capitalize on that because they were in England at the time. So it's not a simple case of saying with Emma, oh, well, she just picked the son who was able to take control, because he wasn't. Half of Canute had been ruling Denmark on behalf of his father, and he was stuck there. There was trouble, and he was stuck. He couldn't get back in time. And what happened ultimately was that Harold reigned for a couple of years and then died, and then half of Canute reigned for a couple of years, and then he died. Don't think it wasn't a long-lived family, because Canute had died young, and so had his father. So all of this might have been, congenital rather than, foul play. So I'm not really sure what Emma's motives were. It seems like, another option for her could have been to just step away, but she fought for this son. So whether it was political or whether she had genuine affection for him and for his father in a way that she didn't with her first husband and the sons of that marriage, whether that marriage was so terrible. And this line is taken up, I think, by one of the novels that's been written about her, that her first marriage was so terrible, she just didn't want any memories of it. And that reflected on her feelings with her children. But this is not... We do know a little bit, actually, about how the Anglo-Saxons, and obviously she wasn't Anglo-Saxon by birth, but how the Anglo-Saxons felt in general about their children. And they do seem to have really cared for them. There's a very sad part of Asser's biography of Alfred, where it talks about, the children that he had, and Athelflaed was the eldest, and then Edward. And then there's quite a few that didn't make it to adulthood, or, either stillborn or died in infancy. And the very fact that that's mentioned suggests that it was a sad thing, and it was worthy of mention. We've got a surviving poem from this period that talks about all the trials and tribulations that parents go through getting their children through to adulthood, and how sad they are to see them go and taking off and, to live their own lives. And we have other couples of instances of going right back to the 7th century, of a royal couple losing some children when, again, either stillborn or dying in infancy. And again, it was remarked upon, it was mentioned, it was obviously a sadness. So there's no reason to assume that people back then cared for their children any less than at any other time, and obviously as we do now.
AI is incredible. It can teach you how to fry an egg and even write a poem, pirate style. Yarr! But it knows nothing about your work. Slackbot is different. It doesn't just know the facts. It knows your schedule. It can turn a brainstorm into a brief. And it doesn't need to be taught. Because Slackbot isn't just another AI. It's AI that knows your work as well as you do. Visit slack.com/meet Slackbot to learn more.
Emma wasn't Anglo-Saxon, but I don't imagine that the Norman tradition was any different. So it's a really difficult thing to know why she almost forgot about these other children until they became politically important. And that leads me to suggest something rather horrible, that's all her children were to her, pawns in a political game. And it could well be that that's the case, just because she's a woman and we don't hear about women in history as much as we'd like to, doesn't mean that she was a nice person.
Right.
So there is also that option that she was purely a political animal, and these kids were important to her in terms of what they could do for her politically. That's another take, and I don't think we'll ever know for sure.
That's one thing that never changes is human nature. And maybe it's possible that Emma's own upbringing is kind of how she behaved later with her children. If she was seen as a pawn and that's all she's ever known, well, then it's possible that she just continued that pattern in her own life and said, okay, well, this is just the way that it is. And we just have to make these tough choices. And then it is what it is.
Yeah. And certainly there is a tradition, less so with the Anglo-Saxons, but it does happen, that mothers didn't stay with their children. Mm-hmm. It's not quite the setup that you get in later medieval times. But we do know that Anglo-Saxon children were fostered. They did go and live with other families. But there's more of a case for saying that they were because their own parents had died young. I'm thinking particularly of the sons of King Edmund I in the 10th century, who was murdered at quite a young age, and his boys were very young, and they were sent off to be fostered in the houses of the leading nobles of the time. So there's perhaps a slightly different tradition, but you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, Emma was brought to England as a political bride, you know, and it's absolutely not a love match. And royal wives became important when she arrived to marry Athelred and Ready. That's when his mother essentially lost all her influence. So there is a long-standing tradition during this period of the mothers of younger kings being very influential, literally, you know, the power behind the throne, but then kind of losing that when their sons get married. So Emma would have been in a really, you know, preeminent position, and she would have enjoyed all of that. Probably didn't want to lose it because, you know, this was all she's known all her life. She did then suffer hardships. I mean, at one point she was stuck in London with Canute advancing and her husband was elsewhere. She may have had little choice about marrying Canute. That's the other thing we've got to remember. And again, as you say, if that's what she's been used to, being a political pawn, then she's going to start to, you know, to live her life in those terms because that's all she knows. So power is important. It's not exactly even just the power, I don't think. It's the comfort. The nobles and the royals and the religious are the ones who are going to live nice long lives because they're the best fed. If you're rich, you've got land. If you've got land, you've got people who are serving you. You can raise an army if you need to. It's the privileged life, and it's the best life to have in these times. So she's going to want to hang on to it. Imagine if she'd said no to Canute. What would have happened to her? Yeah. You know, there probably wasn't much choice. There was no place for her in England once Canute became king if she didn't become his wife. So I'm not sure how much agency she had at that point. I think she was probably just thinking, this is the only way I'm going to survive politically and maybe survive literally. So that we can kind of explain why she married him, why she championed her son over the others. That's going to stay a mystery. Yeah.
I have to know, was there a risk at all for her to be executed by Canute if she hadn't agreed? I mean, when we look at the Tudors, obviously Henry VIII would, you know, get rid of his wife by unfortunately chopping off her head. But was I feel like that was such a new thing. But was she at risk, or would he maybe have just sent her back to Normandy, or would that have been even more of a risk?
I don't think her life would have been at risk. There's no precedent. There's no evidence. I mean, certainly in England, this was not happening to women. There is one story, and it's said to be part of the reason that Canute's father invaded in the first place, because there was a Dane living in England, name of Palig. And one story about the horrific St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, when King Ethelred ordered loads of Danes to be killed. There is a story that Palig's wife was amongst those killed. And it was partly a revenge attack that brought Sven Forkbeard over to England. He was Canute's father. But we can't corroborate that story. It may just have been made up for effect. And there's a lot of detail about that incident that is made up for effect. No need, because it was horrific. And we do have charter evidence signed by the king himself saying, yes, I ordered this done. And we have archaeological evidence of charred human remains from that particular site. So we know it happened. But this may just have been an embellishment. If it wasn't an embellishment, then this woman was killed. And that was awful. But there is no evidence that women were summarily executed at this time. Because in actual fact, in Anglo-Saxon England, very few people were executed anyway. It just wasn't a thing. And my most recent nonfiction book, all about murder in Anglo-Saxon England, one of the first things when I started researching was I just suddenly realized I'd never really thought about it. But you were very, very unlikely to die if you killed someone. Justice didn't work like that in England. The whole justice system was based on a compensation scheme. Every person, from a slave right up to the king, had a man price. Again, the word man as in mankind, as in human. It was known as the weregild. And if you injured someone or you took their life, you paid the compensation to them or their family based on the value of their life. And even slaves, obviously they didn't get paid their weregild, that went to their owners. But everybody's life had a value placed upon it. So you're very unlikely, if you're a thief, you're going to hang. Almost certainly. If you steal, housebreaking, you're going to die. You're going to swing on the gallows. But if you kill or you're violent, not so much. Very strange system. It's not unique to England. The Welsh had something very, very similar, and other countries as well. So execution is not the big deal. What is happening a lot of times is that royals, political opponents, they are getting murdered.
Yes.
but this is all very shady. It's amazing how many rival claimants to the throne just coincidentally died at a really convenient time for their political rivals. So there was a lot of that going on. But the idea of people being executed a la Henry VIII, no. And certainly not women. So I don't think that Emma would have been in any danger, but that's not to say that she didn't feel that she was in danger, because, according to one source, she was stuck in London on her own when Canute was advancing, and she may have felt absolutely helpless and absolutely powerless. And, you can almost imagine that Canute sends for her to be brought to him. She might be thinking, what's going to happen to me? Yeah. But I think the likelihood is he's either going to marry her, which he did, or, as you say, send her back to Normandy. And again, would she wanted to do that? Because she's not going to have the same power that she's used to if she goes back to Normandy. It's also a bit of a disgrace. So I don't think it was necessarily her idea to marry Canute, but she would have gone along with it because I think it would have suited her purposes much better.
I think of the Wars of the Roses, and now I'm going to compare this to Emma's plight in this moment in history. Would she have been able to claim sanctuary in a church like, say, Elizabeth Woodville did when Richard III came to the throne?
Yes, she would have been. Let me get my dates right. Yeah. Because I think go back to the laws of Athelstan. So he's reigning in the early 920s. There's something in his laws about sanctuary, so this is a thing. The only question is whether Canute would have actually honored that.
Yes, considering the differences, right? Yeah, I find that interesting. Okay, I definitely want to talk about Ethelfled because I think she's interesting. I know you've written a book about her. And so this is a subject you are well versed in. We always look at her as this strong female figure from history. But who influenced her? How did she become the woman that we see now?
Oh, well, that's such a good question because we don't know. So obviously she's Alfred the Great's eldest child, and we know that. She was sent at quite a young age to be married to the leader of Mercia. He's never called a king, except by sources in Ireland. He was known as the Lord of the Mercians, but that's quite a title in itself. To be, for example, Alfred's wife was known as the Lady of the English. You know, she's Alfred the Great's wife. Come on, she's a queen, but she was known as the lady. So to be the lord or the lady, he's obviously not royal, but he's above the leading nobles. He's got a strange status. He's married off to her. It's a political marriage. Evidence suggests that he was more the same age as her father. They worked together to free London from the Vikings, and London was at that point part of Mercia, and he was given control of it, and he was also given Alfred's daughter. So, you know, that worked out well. But this couple then became a real power couple, working together, issuing charters. Something happened to him. So we think they got married around about 886, around about then. So we think she was born around about 879, 880. So she would have been quite young, still in her teens, probably when they got married. He's a lot older. He would have had to have been a lot older by virtue of the fact that he's got to where he is. You know, he's a seasoned warrior. He must be. So round about 902, he had been working alongside Alfred and later on with Edward the Elder, Athelflaed's brother, Alfred's eldest son, and the three of them were working together to push back the Vikings. And then round about 902, he kind of disappears from the record. And when we piece together with other Irish sources, it does look as if he was ill for quite some time. So he didn't die until 911. So, you know, from 902 to 911, something's wrong with him, that he can't lead his own troops, but he's not dead. It's never specified what's wrong with him. It's only one Irish source says that at one point he was, in disease at the point of death. Oh. So something was taking a long time to kill him. That's, you know, it's not a battle wound, that we know for sure. And what is incredible and almost completely unprecedented is that she then takes over. And what's really interesting is not only is it the first time really that a woman has led an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. There were a couple of other examples, but it didn't go too well. So it's really the first time that a woman has led a kingdom. It's also a kingdom that's at war and, you know, under siege from the Vikings. And her husband wasn't a king. He was just a leading nobleman. So immediately we have to think, well, why didn't they just elect another man? Right. You know, why didn't they just... and it is shown that they tried to in The Last Kingdom. I do remember that scene where they said, no, we're not having a woman leader. But there's no evidence that scenario happened. It does seem genuinely that the Mercians were quite happy for her to take over. I think part of the reason might have been that there was a handover, because the Irish source that says that at one point he was at disease and at the point of death, it gives the impression that in 907, when Chester was overrun by the Vikings and they were pushed out, the way that this source tells it is she was in charge, but he was directing the operation. He was telling her what she needed to do. So I like this idea that something had laid him low, something had incapacitated him, but he was able to pass on his knowledge and his expertise and his ideas to her. So I think she had a long apprenticeship, you know, where he was still there to guide and advise her. So I think that she learned most of what she knew from him, because she was having to take his place, but he was still there to help her for some of that time. So I think that's likely where she learnt what she needed to do. Obviously, she would have had people advising her as well. But what's fascinating for me is this idea that all around her, these advisors, they were men. They were men. And let's not forget, she was a daughter of Wessex. She was half Mercian. Her mother was Mercian. So I think that would have helped, the Mercians accept her. But it's incredible, isn't it, to think that in this warrior-led society where it's the men doing all the ruling and doing all the fighting, suddenly this woman is allowed to lead the country. And what a character she must have had, because she must have had to have been such a strong personality to carry that off and to do it. So I just find her endlessly fascinating, because it's not just circumstance, it has to be character and personality as well. Yeah. Those two things must have combined for it to be successful, and it was hugely successful. And her brother was quite happy when he became king to leave her alone to get on with ruling Mercia. He did take a couple of strategic towns back under his control, but he left the rest to her. And brother and sister were fighting together. And it's a really organized campaign, because they start building fortified towns. And and I've done this, draw them all out on a map, you can see that they're operating in a kind of a pincer movement. As he's going east, she's going west, and that they end up sort of pushing out and then meeting again in the middle. Wow. Really allowing, one would take one town while another was defending another, really working together. And famously, he then did not let her daughter, she did actually succeed her mother. So again, a woman succeeding a woman ruler did not happen again until Tudor times, when Elizabeth succeeded Mary. So again, this is something almost unique, but it didn't last long, because at that point, Edward said, no, I'm having Mercia for myself, thank you very much. Or more importantly, I think Edward was saying, I'm having Mercia because I've got quite a few adult sons now that all expect an inheritance. Yeah. But also, I think it probably, again, speaks to Aethelflaed's character, that maybe her daughter was not the same caliber as her mother. And perhaps Edward could see the way the wind was blowing and say, no, this is not going to work. Your mother was really special. She was, she knew what she was doing. I don't think you do. There may have been an element of that. But yeah, just an incredible story. It never happened again. Like I say, not until the Tudors came along. There were no queen regnants, apart from technically maybe the Empress Matilda. But, even she couldn't get enough support to make it work. And in the end, she had to say, OK, I'll step back as long as you promise that my son can reign when the time comes. For what is it, 500 years, it didn't happen again. But I don't think that's the surprise. I think the surprise is that it happened at all. It's an incredible story.
It's just like the right set of circumstances for her.
I think so. Yeah. And she must have, obviously she was well known, because she'd been living in Mercia. She'd been working alongside her husband, and they obviously were. It wasn't a love match, but I think they obviously grew to at least like each other and respect each other. And as I say, if this Irish source is true, and that when he was ill, she was acting on his behalf and he was telling her what to do, I mean, that's a great relationship. And I think that's, as I said, I think that's where she learnt a lot of what she needed to do to make it work. And she did make it work. She was so successful, right up to the point when she died. People were still sending delegations to her to say, can you come and help us against these invaders? Just a remarkable story.
Wow. Yeah. What a perfect set of circumstances for her. I have to go back to her mother, because I feel like she's a woman I know very little about. I can't even tell you what her name is. And if you wrote it down and showed me, I probably wouldn't even be able to pronounce it. But you said, her mom was from Mercia. And so, I don't know, could you tell us a little bit about who her mom was?
Not that much, I'm afraid, because here's the really strange thing. We know that she was remembered as the Lady of the English. And it was important, her status, when Edward was fighting off various claimants. He kept reminding people, just remember who my mother was as well as my father, this kind of thing. We know her name was Elswith. It's a difficult one to pronounce. It's pronounced so many different ways because it's EALHSWITH, a really difficult one. Wow. Asa tells us that she was the daughter of a Mercian. Now, he wasn't a king. He was the leader of one of the many tribes that existed in Mercia at that time, because Mercia was a bit of a federation, a lot of tribes that came together to form a kingdom. What Asa does not tell us, in fact, is her name. And what again, this is a sort of, Athelflaed is, as far as I'm concerned, a bit of an anomaly, but so is her mother, because Asa, the contemporary source, remember, who's writing Alfred's biography, does not name her. He tells us, I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, just got confused then for a moment with my Anglo-Saxon names. He tells us everything about the family, but he doesn't tell us her name. And whilst I said that Athelflaed and her husband were issuing lots of charters in their joint names, and all the charters that were issued, they were usually charters confirming grants of land or decisions that had been made. And what would happen is that all the people who were present on that day would be included on the witness list. And it's a great source for us because we can say who was where at a particular time, because if they witnessed this particular charter that was issued at a particular place and time, then we can say that that person was there. And there was a pecking order on the witness lists, and 9 times out of 10 it would be the king at the top and then his wife. Okay. Then the more important royal children, and then the clergy in strict rank. So if an archbishop happened to be there, he would be first, and then the nobility in order. Now, what is incredible about Alfred's wife, she didn't witness any charters. Or put it another way, all the charters we have that survive from his reign, she's not a witness to any of them.
Wow.
And it's so unusual. You think, oh, well, this is a man who just kept his wife completely in the background, had no regard for her, right? That's one take. But we know that she was incredibly well looked after in his will. So she was important to him. So again, we've got this strange paradox, this strange anomaly that, on the one hand, she's not witnessing any charters. She's not named by the most contemporary source for his life. But on the other hand, she's remembered as the Lady of the English. Prayers are ordered to be said for her soul. She's really, really well taken care of in her husband's will. And we know that she came from a high-ranking Mercian family. So again, I would love to just go back in time and just be a fly on the wall to find out what the relationship was really like between Alfred and his wife. Because we're sort of getting mixed messages in a way from the documentary evidence. So this happens a lot, unfortunately, with this period, because we can only rely on the evidence that we've got. And we know there would have been a lot more. I mean, again, going back to Mercia, wherever, well, not just Mercia, wherever the Vikings overran, they did have a tendency to set things on fire.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. And, all the documents tended to be stored by and large in religious buildings, and they were sort of prime targets for the Vikings. We'll take what we can carry that's shiny and sparkly here. We'll just burn all this papery stuff.
Right.
So So there would have been a lot more, I feel, if the Vikings hadn't come along. But
darn Vikings. I do, when you were talking about that, I was thinking, what would be the reasons that she would not have witnessed these things? And the first thing that popped into my head is maybe she just wasn't interested in it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And again, that sort of flies in the face of how she was presented in The Last Kingdom, because she comes across as a really sort of strong, forceful, scheming character in that.
Yes.
But yeah, I honestly, I can't see any other reason, because, I mean, Asa gives us this great, long, complicated story about a previous queen of Wessex, who was actually a Mercian. She was the daughter of King Offa, and she disgraced herself because she didn't like her husband's advisor, so she poisoned him, but she accidentally poisoned her husband as well. A great long story about how she had to flee. It's a load of rubbish. But Asa says that's the reason why, henceforth, the wives of the kings of Wessex were no longer given the title of queen. And certainly, she was remembered as the lady of the English rather than the queen. But actually what Asa says isn't true, because after that supposed story, there were plenty of queen consorts who were given the title of queen, or Regina, and they were witnessing charters. And you'll see their name and then, Regina afterwards. So it's not as if she was a victim of this policy that queen consorts weren't that important and they didn't deserve that status. It's not as if from the point of that story onwards, no royal wives ever witnessed charters. So it's either that Alfred didn't want her there, or she didn't want to be there. There doesn't seem to be any other rational explanation for this. And I just wonder whether she would rather have just quietly been doing something else, It's really difficult to know, because, again, without these witness lists, we can't say, because the kings travelled all up and down. So they were issuing charters from various places, and wherever they went, then the local nobles would come and be part of the Witan meeting and witness these documents. But because her name isn't on there, we don't know whether she was travelling with him. That's the frustration. And it may have been that she wasn't. Maybe she decided to just sit at home and say, it'll be peaceful without you. I'll see you when you get back. Really difficult to know. But as I say, she was really well provisioned for in his will. And he clearly wanted to make sure that she was well looked after he'd gone. So I don't think it's from a lack of respect. But again, I think it's just one of those things that we will never know, sadly. Again, a novelist's dream, because you can make up all sorts of reasons why it didn't happen, but we can't say for sure.
I am just, like I said at the beginning, I am fascinated by this period in history. The time has just flown by today. I just looked at the time and I thought, we have to start wrapping up now. Like just as I feel like we were just getting going on it. But I want to know if you had to tell the listener why this period of history is so important to study. If you're interested in English history, if you're interested in royal history, why is it important to look at the Anglo-Saxon period?
I think there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, it is actually where the origins of our current justice system came into being. I mean, the idea of 12 men or women as part of a jury, this goes right back to a time when people in Anglo-Saxon England had to provide 12 witnesses to speak for them in a trial. So I think that's one reason. I think you need to go back to see the origins of that developing. We also need to remember that the language that you and I are speaking right now is, developed from Old English, which is what the Anglo-Saxons spoke. So although we've got this horrible line that cuts through history in 1066, we need to look back beyond it. That's not when England started. And you need to know about the culture, and to remember that the Middle Ages, the medieval period, is made up of lots of different segments, and the Anglo-Saxon era, we don't call it the Dark Ages anymore. The term Anglo-Saxon can be problematic, as I'm sure you know. Sometimes we say early medieval, but it's different from what came after 1066. And as we've been talking this last hour, about women's rights and agency and power and influence, the very first Anglo-Saxon royal women in the 7th century, they were the ones who were instrumental in the conversion of the English to Christianity. They were the ones who were founding monasteries and abbeys and spreading the word. And I think it's important to know how these things happened, how these institutions came into being. So, and yeah, it's just so interesting. I love it. But I think you need the perspective. You need to know what happened before 1066 to make more sense of what happened after it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I could not agree more. That was one of the first things. When I started studying, it was the Plantagenet rule that pulled me in. But inevitably, I landed with the Tudors because it was the drama and the intrigue, even though the Plantagenets had plenty of that.
Oh, yeah.
But I always find it so important, and I tell people all the time, you have to look backwards. You have to keep going backwards to understand why these people became who they became, because history carries with us. Even now, I think of my parents who are of the baby boomer generation and how their childhood shape them into who they are today. My parents were always penny pinchers. They were always afraid that the next bad thing was going to happen and they were going to be left without, but that was because of their childhood. And the same thing goes with history. It all shaped them into who they became later.
Absolutely. I was saying this I was a guest on someone's blog, and I've recently written a short story for an anthology, and it was about what happened to a village in 1066. But I was saying we have to remember that these people who were alive in 1066, they didn't just live through that moment. One of the older characters also lived through Canute's invasion. And I had this character, with the idea that, this will never happen again in our lifetime, as people of the Second World War lived through the First World War, never thought it would happen again. Yeah. And it just suddenly dawned on me that, when we talk about people living through a particular event in history, that's not the only event that they lived through. And as you say, what you've lived through and what you've experienced shapes your decisions and shapes the future generations. So yeah, always look backwards.
Always. Well, Annie, I want to give you an opportunity to promote your own work because you have written several books, and I want you to be able to tell people about them.
Oh, I'll just be very brief. So I've written 4 novels set in Anglo-Saxon England, mainly in Mercia. I've got 3 full-length non-fiction titles. The most recent one I mentioned is Murder in Anglo-Saxon England. And I've contributed to lots of anthologies as well. So probably the best thing to do is look me up on that famous online shopping site or my website, which is anniewhiteheadauthor.co.uk. And you can find all the details of my books on my blog there.
Perfect. And I will include links to all of that in the show notes, but I'll also include links to our previous discussions because that might fill in some gaps of things that we've missed today. The murders episode, that one was so fun to do with you as well. So Annie, thank you so much for coming on again today.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.